Let me start my presentation with three very recent quotes. In Christian Europe, there was honor in work. People had dignity. Men and women were equal. The family was the basis of the nation. The nation was the basis of Europe. And states guaranteed security. In today's open society Europe, there are no borders. European people can be really replaced with immigrants. The family has been transformed into an optional, fluid form of cohabitation. The nation, national identity, and national pride are seen as negative and obsolete notions. And the state no longer guarantees security in Europe, or believed Mr. Orban. The second, our common mission is to repel the enemy, to protect our homeland, our future, and the future of the new generations from the tyranny that the attacker seeks to bring with his bayonets. The truth is on our side. Therefore, the enemy, with the help of God and with the support of the whole civilized world, will be defeated. Metropolitan Epiphanius of Ukraine, 2022. And the third one, there is no contradiction between the church and patriotism. At the same time, however, we can see in our country the emergence of attitudes opposed to patriotism. Their common ground is egotism. It is an unchristian attitude. It is also national egotism, nationalism that cultivates the feeling of its own superiority, closing itself to other national communities and to the community of all people, the Polish Bishop Conference. So defending the value system of Christian Europe, defending the nation with the help of God, and defending the nation against nationalism. Three recent statements from three different countries in Central and Eastern Europe. Such ideas and avowals build the provocative ground to take a closer look to the points of connection between religion and security. I have only two theses to put forward in this talk, and I am to make them understandable and discussable. The first is that the region, Central and Eastern Europe, can be appropriately interpreted in the theoretical framework of wounded collective identity. The primary marker of the region is the crucial hermeneutical power of the historical traumas and the strong presence of these traumas in the memory. The second point is that the presence and various roles of religions in the region can be adequately understood by investigating the theory of securitization. I am fully aware that these two arguments may have a shocking effect. Well, scholars of religion, mainly trained in one or another of the social sciences, will be irritated by the arguments of wounded collective identity and securitization. They have practice with theories of modernization and secularization. I am fighting not against these approaches, and my goal is not to discredit their legitimacy. I am only convinced and motivated to argue for a better understanding which takes the regional experience more seriously. In my paper, as a scholar of religion, I will first posit security and securitization as the essential dimension of religion. Then I will concentrate on the transformations and the shared identity of Central and Eastern Europe. The region has been intrinsically threatened and wounded through global and regional processes. After describing the main marker of the region, I will come to my second point. In a wounded world, in societies plagued by many insecurities, we can best understand religion in relation to security and insecurity. So religion is securitization. We scholars of Religionswissenschaft and religious history know better than other experts of other disciplines dealing with religion that there is no religion as such, as an independent objective. Instead, religion is always an interpretative category for the understanding of culture, history, and society. Keeping these shared sense regarding religion in mind, my first argument is that religion, in its very different forms, has a fundamental character as defender and securitizer. I try to demonstrate this argument by referring only to the understanding of prayer as a central element of almost all religions. In the introduction of his major work on prayer, Friedrich Heiler writes page after page explaining that prayer and religion are inseparable. He cites a number of philosophers, theologians, and religious historians to support of his claim. Quoting Schleiermacher, he expresses his own conviction and the basis for his description of prayer in religious studies that being a believer and praying are ultimately one and the same thing. End quote. In sum, by taking prayer as a constitutive element of religion, we can understand religion essentially as a defender and securitizer. Moreover, religion demonstrates its elementary defender character in the various concept of salvation. People are in trouble. It is the main basic anthropology of almost all well-known religions. And religion provides their salvation. Last but not least, religious communities generally interpret themselves as communities of salvation. Not only the big religions like Judaism or Islam, but small religious communities as well, sects and cults as well. I quote Heiler, "The original occasion for prayer is always an apparent concrete emergency in which the elementary life interests of an individual or a group are seriously threatened." End quote. Ultimately, prayer is always a prayer of petition in which one speaks to the deity in the situation of one's own endangerment and that of one's loved ones. This is how Luther understands prayer, in which man turns to God as a refuge in all his troubles. The basic premise of Friedrich Heiler's great monograph on prayer is that trouble teaches us to pray. Prayer can be categorized in phenomenological approach to religion, but ultimately the prayers of the history of religion refute strict distinctions. The Islamic Salat prayer is, for example, is a good example of this, and is the prayer of the ancient Egyptian laborer Nofer Abu, in which the point is that man stands before the deity in his total vulnerability and at the same time in his total hope. So to end this part of the presentation, this first one, the main point here is that religion as an interpretative category always plays a role of delineation and negation of the other, which is declared not only as profane, it could be taken as neutral term, but as well as threat like idolatry, magic, superstition, sects, heresies, cults, and so on. Religion is for the faithful, and I think as well for the outside observer as well, securitization. It is my first thesis. The second point is that if you take a look to the sensibilities and observations of today's almost global situation of our world, then first come in mind everything is threatened and everything is more and more insecure. So after seeing defense and security as the main constructive element of religion, I want to turn to my second point. Security has become the highest need and value globally, and, which is for me especially important, regionally in Central and Eastern Europe. But first, the global. What has happened in Ukraine in the past few months has shown how vulnerable societies and states are in the 21st century. Insecurity and vulnerability are terms and dimensions more and more at stake in public affairs and in scholarly reflections. On this path, I will first give some global, then some regional evidences concerning the broad relevance of highest importance of the questions of security. To be threatened is a common experience and feeling in the global world, as has become evident in the last 2 decades. Denis Jodelet, Jörg Walla, and Eva Drozda-Schenkowska edited a book published in 2020 by Springer, whose title underlines my exact point. You can see societies under threat. The collected chapters focus on the topic of threats, which to date have not attracted much attention in either public policy debate or scientific life. It's the main argument why they took this topic in focus of the editors. The publication addresses migratory movements, climate change, and terrorism. I was not surprised that we will meet in Poland in some years, and in Groningen the focus will be to the question religion and environment. It's clear. The concept of threat seems to increasingly predominate, thus substantially altering the representations of and sensitivities of our contemporaries. As the editors closed the manuscript and sent it to the publisher, the pandemic called COVID-19 had just begun to become a worldwide threat. Authors refer to the Spanish flu, it's a similarity, as the biggest pandemic in world history, with the important remark of how little it was commemorated in the humanities and social sciences compared with works on the First World War. So Spanish flu was not so important, but the war was important, although more people died infected in Spanish flu as in the First World War, remarked the authors. Millions of families mourned their relatives because of the flu, and the memory lived on in the private sphere. In sum, the book Societies Under Threat signals a fundamental challenge for the humanities and social sciences, among them religious studies, to elaborate a special approach focusing on the basic global fact of traumas, threats, and fear. So to go deeper or to more near to my beloved region, Central and Eastern Europe, there are a lot of wounds present in the history, but the more present in today's memory works on memory wars. In recent years and months, many examples in Central and Eastern Europe have verified the decisive political factor of traumas. I have referred above to the monstrosities of the war in Ukraine. It is abundant enough to remember the massacre and mass graves in Bucha, Ukraine. In May this year, Prime Minister Orban of Hungary expressed in a radio interview that at one time, Hungary had a sea, but it was taken away. Promptly came the answer from Zagreb, and the Hungarian ambassador was summoned to the Minister of Foreign Affairs. For another example, in April, Lithuania's president urged Sweden and Finland to join NATO, because Lithuania feared being the next Ukraine. Bit right. Gitanas Naussi says that admitting the Nordic nations would improve the security situation in the Baltic region. The list of sensibilities, fears, and security issues is endless and demonstrates the collective existential instability of the societies that were re-established after the fall of communism. It is not possible to speak about Central and Eastern Europe today without mentioning more deep the war in Ukraine. However, this war is not the first after the Second World War. We have to remember the Yugoslav wars between 1991 till 2001. The 10-day war in Slovenia, the Croatian war, the Bosnian war, the Kosovo war, the two armed insurgencies in the Preševo Valley and in the Republic of Macedonia. These armed conflicts were about redrawing borders, defending state sovereignty, and securing ethnic national identity. We have experienced the same in Ukraine, not only for months, but for years. Crimea was occupied by Russian army after the Maidan revolution in 2014 and declared by President Putin as part of Russia. The war and occupation of the Donbass and recently of other cities and regions of the Ukraine is declared by President Putin partly as a national duty to defend the oppressed Russian population and partly as defense of Russia against America and Western European interests and influences. Insecure borders, border sensibilities, and diplomatic and armed conflicts along the national and state borders belong to the main characteristics of the region of Central and Eastern Europe. The question of state borders is always tied closest to the question of national identities. The history of Central and Eastern Europe since the national awakening in the 18th century has been, in principle, the history of insisting on national and national state identities. But if we take a closer look, a more analytical look at the history of the entire region beyond focusing on a particular country only, it is evident that most of the border conflicts in the region come from the geopolitical and geocultural in-between status of the region. For centuries, borders and national and state affiliations were defined by the hegemonic empire powers from the west and the east. The endless needs and cries for sovereignty and autonomy under the various occupations have emphasized the common sense of the region, with a formative influence on the region's sensibilities and leading to the temptations of nationalism, xenophobia, and nationalist hysteria. The region of Central and Eastern Europe is a border region as such, and displays symptoms of the collective borderline disorder. And now, back once again to the war in Ukraine. President Putin and Patriarch Kirill argued for the war and declared the reason for the war in the frame of conflict between the West, America and the EU, and the East, Russian world. Just like almost 100 years ago, 80 years ago, in the case of Holodomor, causing the starvation of millions in 1932 and 3, triggered by the Hitler-Stalin Pact, and in the way of Ukraine was declared after the Second World War as part of the Soviet Union. Today, Putin wants to block the free diplomatic Western orientation of independent Ukraine. All these above-mentioned historical and recent traumas are not extreme exceptions. They symbolize and demonstrate the massive importance of the collective wounds in societies of Central and Eastern Europe. Politics and people also understand their fate through the lens of wounded collective identity. Reflected or not reflected, it is not a question. And they are captivated by real and imagined types of pain. For a proper understanding of the region and the presence and the function of religion in Central and Eastern Europe, it is necessary to put the factor of wounded collective identity in the center of the interpretation. Not only the recent war in Ukraine, not only the unstable borders in the last century, but the entire geocultural and geopolitical setting of the region is marked primarily by in-betweenness. The region is a border region with all the consequences of this status. Strong hegemonies have fought against each other on this borderland, on this nobody's land, but it is somebody's land, which is Central and Eastern Europe. It is not a coincidence that very prominent Yale historian Timothy Snyder called this region bloodlands between Hitler and Stalin, published first 2012. Or that 70 years before, a Polish historian, Oskar Halecki, called it in his monograph, The Borderlands of Western Civilization, a history of East Central Europe. The consciousness of in-betweenness and mutual occupations are not only characteristic of Central Europe, so Poland, Slovakia, Czech Republic, Hungary. It is the main historical factor for the Baltic states as well, and for the Balkans. So far, researchers such as Manuela Boatke or Zoltán Ginelli and others are analyzing the region using the post-colonial approach. Central and Eastern Europe can be understood, according to them, as a colony of the hegemonic empires of Germans and Habsburgs, Russians and Soviets, and Ottomans. The definitive in-between status of the region goes back, perhaps, to the time of the Roman Empire. Wounded by this vitally historical heritage, societies and their representatives react in a particular manner to every national and international affair. To understand the difference between Western European cultures and Central and Eastern European, the primary key is the trauma tradition I am arguing. Based on historical data and analysis of contemporary novels written by authors from Central and Eastern Europe, I summarize the insights and impressions under the technical term wounded collective identity, explained it with a minimalist definition. Wounded collective identity is a metaphoric construction of the collective self-consciousness with significant elements such as the trauma-centered memory, the feeling of being threatened, and an obsessive demand for permanent self-determination. Wounded collective identity is not a descriptive category. It is an approach for a proper understanding of the region's particular dynamics. Wounded collective identity is like a primordial code with which the societal and religious processes can be decoded. The region's history is full of traumas, such as the mutual occupations by the hegemonies of East and West, as I am already said, the often brutally persecuted minority status of significant populations, the prohibition of the use of human rights and language rights, the population exchange after the redrawing of national borders, and such as the outrageous shame of genocides during Holodomor, the Holocaust, Srebrenica, and most recently in Ukraine. All these traumas have a decisive impact on the self-understanding of the region as historical baggage. They yield to the temptation to feel victimized, to have xenophobic tendencies, to have an irritated sensibility regarding national identity and sovereignty. I do not have enough time, although I have much time, but not enough time to detail further the approach to wounded collective identity. Allow me allude to my German language book, Freiheit und Populismus, 2019 by Springer, and some journal articles and YouTube videos of mine in English as well. The argumentation of my paper today leads toward a further theoretical step. How can we interpret religious transformations in the region of Central and Eastern Europe if we take wounded collective identity as the primary marker of the region? My answer in advance reads as follows. Religion can be appropriately understood through the lens of security and securitization in the region of wounded collective identity. I try to explain my arguments in two tabs concerning securitization. First, I will contrast the approach of wounded collective identity with the approach of modernization, which is most used approach. And the second step, I contrast the approach of secularization with securitization. So, woundedness, analyzing Europe's societal transformation in the last 2 centuries, the primary paradigm is modernization. It is taken for granted. Well-known authors from sociology forged the term and designated the multifaceted theory of modernization. Let me only refer to Peter L. Berger or Anthony Giddens, and later on Shmuel Eisenstadt with his profound modification of the original theory under the technical term multiple modernizations. The main elements of the theory are signified, theory of modernization, are signified by the developmental approach represented by the word higher level, higher level. People educated at the higher level, a higher level of women in the education and workplaces, higher level industrial production, and higher level inhabitants in cities and capitals. So the concept of modernization goes to higher level. What is higher? And the higher level can be observed in different societies. The higher level is the level of modernization. In contrast, lesser level and so on. Now, almost all descriptions and interpretations focused on the highest developed European societies and states like Great Britain, Ireland perhaps, Germany, France, and outside of Europe, the USA and Japan. In the last 2 decades, many authors have signaled the starting point of modernism and the universal validity of the main arguments of modernity. Among them, Manuela, the already mentioned Manuela Boatke, explained in many scientific journal articles and her book, recently published and co-authored with Anca Parvulescu, 2022, how it is necessary to concentrate on the worldview and interpretation of Central and Eastern European in-between zone of empires. In this effort, they investigated mainly the theoretical framework, as I already mentioned, post-colonialism, and the other important focus is, or approach is, inter-imperiality. I have proposed in my works to take a step forward toward the analysis of the main historical experiences of the region, Central and Eastern Europe, and their powerful presence in our time. And what is more, instead of borrowing theories from outside the region, we have to develop an original idea based precisely on the identity markers of the region. This is the approach which I call wounded collective identity. And the other, securitization, is more appropriate as the approach of secularization. The theory of secularization is the main approach to analyzing religious transformations. For over half a century, this type of hermeneutics dominates the field of sociology and the field of common understanding of religion as well. As in case of modernization, the theory of secularization is driven by the question of more or less. A smaller or larger population of people believe in God, spend time to church going, declare themselves Baptist or Jews, regard religious institutions as competent to be active concerning questions of social life and justice, etc. Because the basic assumption of secularization is that the modern society is, the less religious it is. The analysis of the religious fields is quite simple in that way and valid in every area of culture. That is why the theory of secularization has a fantastic career in the last 20 or 60 years, because it is so clear and so simple, although there is a big jungle about the critics and about the different explanations of the theory. Critics of the theory come mainly from outside of the North Atlantic sphere. Famous and well respected is the critic of Talal Assad, for instance. Another type of critics tries to focus on statistically not measurable dimensions of religion. First of all, in the public in the public. José Casanova can be taken as a leading proponent of this approach. Although there are many profound critics who are widely accepted in fields of study that touch on religion, the approach of secularization still holds the leading position, focusing on the region of Central and Eastern Europe, which is characterized, in my understanding, as a collective wounded region. The approach of secularization has a relevance, but a limited one. Although for 30 years we have had thousands of national and international papers using this theory in the region, the main marker of the region remains less researched and analyzed. If we have a careful look at the inner dynamics of societies in Central and Eastern Europe, we are not very much confronted with the question of whether more or less religious activity can be observed. No, we are confronted with questions of national sovereignty, coping with traumas and insecurity as a societal phenomenon, dealing with questions of economic, political and welfare positions in Europe and in the whole world. The decisive factors of societal transformations and collective sensibilities are most connected to the question of ontological, existential and societal security problems, not only because of the recent war in the Ukraine, but since the collapse of the former world order with less freedom but more stability and security. Allow me to go back to the three quotations at the very beginning of my lecture. All of them provide explicit insights to the definitive connection between the region's wounds and security providing religion. As the Hungarian Prime Minister stated, today's open society Europe no longer guarantees security in Europe, but the Christian Europe we are fighting for does. As the Metropolitan Epiphanius of Ukraine explained, our common mission is to protect our homeland with the help of God. And in the third statement, the Polish Bishops' Conference pleaded for a Christian patriotism against the unchristian nationalism, fighting against non-Christian enemies and for security for the nation. This represents the fundamental realm and coherence between the main wounds of the region, the deep needs for autonomy and security, and the role of religion in relation to these. These correlations and arguments motivated me to examine the question about religion in relation to the question of security as closely as possible. In the very beginning of my paper, I already highlighted security as one of the constitutive elements of religion, citing the example of prayer. Keeping this in close connection between religion and security in mind, it is not hard to predict that the main marker of the societies of Central and Eastern Europe will show deep correlations with the primary marker of religion. The main point is that I am arguing for, that the appropriate approach to the region of Central and Eastern Europe is the wounded collective identity instead of the framework of modernization, and in addition, the proper analysis of religious processes in the region focuses on religion in correlation to security. Following this logic, religion in the region shows its true character as source and force of security. In the sociological research tradition of religion, Peter R. Berger spoke about the sacred canopy as a secure home for people in modern societies. Anthony Giddens coined the term ontological security as the knowledge about the reality as it must be. And Pippa Norris and Ronald Inglehart talked about existential security, thus religion is less needed if people have secure material circumstances. So the big theoreticals have a sensibility concerning the question of security. All these ideas lack the reflection on the historical and contemporary traumas of societies, particularly in Central and Eastern Europe. They understand religion mainly as centered on the Church and Christianity, and the memory of historical wounds has marginal importance, if any. So can I understand and support very well Jörg Stolz, who may have been right when he highlighted in his presidential address of EASR in 2019 that, I quote him, "It is not so much individual existential security that influences the religiosity of individuals. Rather, it is perceived existential insecurity in society as a whole." End quote. Societies as a whole deliver in various ways decisive traumatic experiences to posterity, which are the mere ground of the need for ontological and any other kind of security religion can provide. The designation of danger and the promise to avert it is a discursive process called securitization. As I stressed in the beginning of my lecture, religion can be understood as securitization. Securitization is, I quote Ligard, "the process of transforming a subject into matter of security by presenting it as involving as an extraordinary problem, requiring certain political actions. Securitization is a discursive process of framing. It is concerned with what political actors do and with the discursive effects of this." End quote. In Central and Eastern Europe, we observe how this constitutive character of religion, which means securitization, is combined with securitization processes. Religion is securitization and is present in the region as securitization. For your attention.